The rope had been prepared. The scaffold stood cold beneath a grey December sky, and Edward Rulloff sat alone in his cell, reading Greek poetry by the light of a single candle. His hands did not shake. His voice, when he spoke to the guard outside, remained calm, measured, almost professorial. He had spent the last months of his life translating ancient texts, constructing theories of language that no scholar of his day could fully comprehend. And yet, in 3 days' time, those hands, the hands that had written treatises on philology, that had sketched diagrams of syntax and etymology, would be bound behind his back, and the trap door would fall. Outside the Binghamton jail, the newspapers had already written his epitaph. They called him Monster, Devil, the educated murderer. But Edward Rulloff had never seen himself that way. He had seen himself as a man of science, a man whose intellect towered above the common rabble, a man whose mind was too vast, too complex to be understood by the crude instruments of law and morality. He had killed, yes, but he had also thought, and in his own estimation the thinking mattered more. The wind rattled the barred window, the candle flame bent and steadied, and somewhere in the distance the church bells of Binghamton tolled the hour, marking the slow passage of time toward the inevitable. Chapter 1. The Arrival. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now, and the world has grown small and still. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whatever hour finds you in your corner of the world, know that you are not alone in the darkness. We are gathered here, you and I, at the edge of sleep and memory, where history whispers its secrets to those willing to listen. Before we begin our journey tonight, I invite you to subscribe to this channel if you have not already done so. Your support helps us continue bringing these forgotten stories back from the shadows of the past. Share this video with those who find comfort in the dark tales of history. And settle in now, for we have a long road to travel together. Tonight, we turn our gaze toward the rolling hills and quiet villages of upstate New York in the middle years of the 19th century. It was a time when the Erie Canal had brought commerce and strangers to small towns that had known only farmers and their seasons. It was a time when education was a rare jewel, when a man who could read Latin was viewed with suspicion and admiration in equal measure. And it was into this world that Edward Howard Rulloff arrived, carrying a physician's bag and a mind that would not rest. The year was 1842, when the young man first appeared in the settlements near Ithaca. He gave his age as 26, though some would later claim he looked older, his features already marked by the intensity of thought that burned behind his pale grey eyes. He spoke with an accent that suggested German origins, though he offered little of his past to those who inquired. He presented himself as a doctor trained in the medical sciences, and in a frontier region where trained physicians were scarce as gold, his credentials were questioned less than they might have been in the cities of the East. Edward Rulloff was not a large man. He stood perhaps 5 feet 9 inches in his boots, with a slender frame that suggested more the scholar than the labourer. His hair was dark and worn longer than the fashion of the time, often falling across his forehead when he bent over his books. His hands were delicate, the fingers long and tapered, suited to holding a pen or a scalpel with equal facility. When he spoke, his voice carried the careful articulation of one who had learned English as a second language, each word selected with precision, each sentence constructed with the deliberation of a man who understood the architecture of speech. He took lodgings first in the village of Dryden, a settlement of perhaps 300 souls scattered along the roads that connected the farms to the mill and the mill to the church. The house where he rented a room belonged to a widow who kept boarders, and she would later recall that her new tenant spent his evenings by candlelight, surrounded by books in languages she could not name. He read constantly, she said, and sometimes she heard him speaking aloud in his room, reciting passages in tongues that sounded ancient and strange in the wooden silence of the house. The people of Dryden were not quick to embrace strangers, but neither were they hostile to a man who offered medical services at reasonable rates. Edward Rulloff attended to their ailments with competence, if not warmth. He set broken bones and lanced infections. He prescribed remedies drawn from both traditional medicine and his own particular theories about the humours and the nervous system. His patients found him distant, clinical in his manner, as though he was studying their sufferings rather than sympathising with them. But his treatments often worked, and in a place where the nearest established physician might be half a day's ride away, the villagers were willing to overlook his peculiarities. Yet there were aspects of Edward Rulloff that troubled those who observed him closely. He had no friends, sought no companionship beyond what was necessary for his practice. He attended no church, offered no explanation for this absence beyond a vague reference to philosophical differences with organised religion. When questioned about his past, about where he had studied medicine, and why he had come to this particular corner of New York, his answers were smooth but uninformative, like water flowing around stone without displacing it. The children of Dryden were frightened of him. They whispered that his eyes were too pale, too cold, that he looked at people the way a man might look at insects pinned to a board. The young boys who were sent to fetch him for medical emergencies reported that his room was filled with strange diagrams and charts, with skulls and bones arranged on shelves, with books whose titles were written in Greek and Latin, and languages even more obscure. One boy claimed to have seen a human brain preserved in a jar of spirits, though whether this was truth or the embroidery of a frightened imagination, none could say with certainty. Edward Rulloff supplemented his medical income by offering lessons in classical languages and higher mathematics. There were ambitious farmers' sons in the region, young men who dreamed of attending university or entering the professions, and their fathers were willing to pay for instruction that might elevate their children beyond the plough and the harvest. Rulloff proved an exacting teacher. He demanded precision, tolerated no laziness, and could recite passages from Homer and Virgil from memory in their original tongues. His students learned, but they did not love him. There was something in his manner that discouraged affection, a sense that he viewed teaching as a transaction rather than a calling, that he cared more for the elegance of the languages themselves than for the minds he was shaping. In the evenings, after his patients had been seen and his students dismissed, Edward Rulloff could be observed walking alone along the roads that wound through the countryside. He walked with his hands clasped behind his back, his head tilted slightly forward, his lips moving silently as though he were engaged in constant internal dialogue. Those who passed him on these walks reported that he seemed barely aware of their presence, that he would acknowledge a greeting with a distracted nod before returning to whatever labyrinth of thought occupied him. The widow who kept his lodging sometimes brought him supper on a tray, and she noticed that he ate sparingly, mechanically, his attention never leaving the book propped open beside his plate. Once, curiosity overcame discretion, and she glanced at the pages he was studying. The text was in a language she did not recognise, with letters that looked almost but not quite like English, arranged in columns with connecting lines drawn between certain words. When she asked what language it was, he looked up at her with those pale eyes and said simply, "Sanskrit." She did not ask again. By the spring of 1843, Edward Rulloff had become a familiar if not beloved figure in the small communities around Ithaca. He had established his practice, proven his competence, and demonstrated an intellect that inspired both admiration and unease among the provincial population. He seemed settled, as much as such a man could be settled, in the rhythms of rural medical practice and private scholarship. But those who knew him best, if anyone could claim to know him at all, sensed that he was waiting for something. There was a restlessness beneath his surface calm, a hunger that could not be satisfied by setting bones and teaching Greek to farmers' sons. He was a man of vast ambitions and narrow circumstances, and the contradiction created a tension that hummed beneath every interaction, every consultation, every evening spent alone with his books and his endless pursuit of knowledge that seemed to serve no purpose beyond itself. The spring rains came late that year, and the roads turned to mud that sucked at wagon wheels and horses' hooves. The world outside Edward Rulloff's window grew green and abundant, but he barely noticed. He was working on something new, a project that consumed his nights and filled his notebooks with dense columns of writing. He had begun to develop a theory about language, about the common roots that connected all human speech, about patterns and structures that he believed he alone had discovered. And it was in this season of mud and renewal that Edward Rulloff first saw Harriet Schutt and decided that he would marry her. Chapter 2: The Bride in the Wooden House. Harriet Schutt was 20 years old when Edward Rulloff began to court her, and she possessed the kind of beauty that flourished briefly in rural communities before being worn away by childbirth and labour. Her hair was dark blonde, almost honey-coloured in the summer sunlight, and she wore it in the simple braided style favoured by young women of modest means. Her eyes were blue and clear, and those who knew her described her as gentle, quiet, perhaps even timid in the presence of men she didn't know well. She was the daughter of William Schutt, a farmer of middling prosperity who owned land near the village of Lansing, north of Ithaca, along the shores of Cayuga Lake. The Schutt family was respectable, church-going, known for honesty in their dealings and kindness to their neighbours. William Schutt had 5 children, and Harriet was neither the eldest nor the youngest, occupying that middle position where a daughter might be overlooked in the daily necessities of farm life. She helped her mother with the cooking and the washing, tended the kitchen garden, and attended the Methodist church every Sunday without fail. Edward Rulloff first encountered her at a gathering in Lansing, one of those social occasions where the farming families came together to mark a harvest or a holiday. He had been invited by one of his students whose family wished to show gratitude for the education their son was receiving. Rulloff attended such gatherings rarely, finding little pleasure in the conversation of people whose concerns centred on crop yields and livestock prices. But on this occasion, he came, and he saw Harriet Schutt standing near the food tables, and something in her quiet demeanour caught his attention. He approached her with the same calculated precision he brought to all his endeavours. He spoke to her of books, of poetry, of ideas that existed far beyond the boundaries of farm and village. Harriet listened, her eyes widening slightly at the scope of his knowledge, at the worlds he described with such casual authority. She had received only basic schooling, could read her Bible and write simple letters, but here was a man who spoke of ancient Greece and Rome as though he had walked their streets, who quoted philosophers whose names she had never heard. Edward Rulloff recognised in Harriet Schutt something useful to his purposes. She was young enough to be impressed by his learning, modest enough to be flattered by his attention, and her family's position was neither so elevated as to scrutinise his background too closely, nor so impoverished as to bring him no material advantage. Moreover, she possessed a quality that Rulloff found particularly valuable. She was biddable, inclined toward obedience, the sort of woman who would not question her husband's decisions or interfere with his work. He courted her through the summer and autumn of 1843. He visited the Schutt farm regularly, always bringing some small gift, a book of poetry, a ribbon, a botanical specimen pressed and labelled with its Latin name. He spoke to William Schutt of his prospects, of his medical practice, of his dreams of perhaps establishing himself more permanently in the region. He said nothing of his past before arriving in New York, and the Schutts, like most people of their time and place, did not press him on matters he chose not to discuss. Harriet's mother had reservations. She confided to her husband that there was something unsettling about the young doctor, something in his eyes that reminded her of winter ice. But William Schutt saw a man of education and profession, a man who could provide for his daughter in ways that a farmer's son could not, and he gave his blessing to the courtship. Harriet herself seemed pleased, even honoured that such a learned man had chosen her. She wrote letters to her cousins describing her suitor's brilliance, his knowledge, the way he made her feel as though she were glimpsing a larger world than she had ever imagined. They were married in December of 1843, in the Methodist church that Harriet had attended all her life. The ceremony was small, attended by the Schutt family and a few of Edward Rulloff's students and patients. The groom wore a dark suit that he had purchased for the occasion, and the bride wore a simple dress of blue wool with a white collar. The minister spoke of duty and devotion, of the sacred bonds of matrimony, of the wife's obligation to honour and obey. Edward Rulloff repeated his vows in that precise accented voice, and Harriet Schutt became Harriet Rulloff, and the church bells rang across the frozen fields. They took rooms in a house near Ithaca, a modest dwelling of wood and plaster with 2 rooms downstairs and a sleeping loft above. Edward Rulloff continued his medical practice and his teaching, and Harriet set about creating a home from the sparse furnishings they possessed. She cooked and cleaned and waited for her husband to return from his rounds, and in the evenings she sat quietly while he read or wrote, knowing better than to disturb him when he was absorbed in his studies. The first months of the marriage passed without incident that neighbours could observe. Harriet was seen at market purchasing supplies, speaking softly to the merchants, always hurrying home as though fearful of being away too long. She attended church less frequently now, and when asked about this, she explained that her husband did not approve of organised worship, that he believed religion was a matter of private conscience rather than public ritual. The explanation satisfied no one, but the matter was not pressed. By spring, Harriet was pregnant. She confided this news first to her mother, who visited the house and found her daughter looking pale and tired, with shadows beneath her eyes that suggested sleep did not come easily. When asked if she was happy, Harriet smiled and said yes, though the smile did not quite reach her eyes. She said that Edward was pleased about the child, that he had already begun reading medical texts about childbirth and infant care, that he approached impending fatherhood with the same scholarly thoroughness he brought to everything else. But there were things Harriet did not tell her mother. She did not speak of the nights when Edward sat at his desk until dawn, writing in notebooks that he kept locked away, muttering to himself in languages she could not understand. She did not mention the times when he looked at her with those pale eyes, and she felt as though he were examining a specimen rather than seeing his wife. She did not describe how he sometimes spoke to her as though she were a student who had failed to grasp a simple lesson, his voice patient but cold, explaining her errors with clinical precision. The neighbours began to notice things. They heard raised voices from the house at odd hours, though never loud enough to distinguish words. They saw Harriet in the garden, moving slowly, carefully, as though something hurt that she would not name. Once, a woman who lived nearby encountered her on the road and noticed what might have been a bruise on her wrist, quickly hidden beneath her sleeve when she saw it had been observed. In April of 1844, Harriet Rulloff gave birth to a daughter. The labour was long and difficult, attended by a midwife from the village, while Edward Rulloff remained in another room, declining to assist despite his medical training. When the child was finally born, the midwife cleaned and wrapped her and brought her to the mother, and Harriet held her daughter and wept with relief and exhaustion. Edward Rulloff came to look at the infant. He examined her with the detached interest of a physician conducting a routine inspection. He noted her weight, the colour of her eyes, the shape of her skull. He didn't hold her, didn't speak the soft words that new fathers typically offer. He simply nodded, as though the child's arrival confirmed some calculation he had made, and returned to his books. They named the baby Priscilla, after no one in particular. Harriet devoted herself to the child's care with the fierce tenderness of a young mother, and for a few weeks the house seemed almost peaceful. But Edward Rulloff grew increasingly irritable with the infant's crying, with the disruptions to his routine, with the way Harriet's attention was now divided between him and the child. He began spending longer hours away from the house, seeing patients, teaching students, walking alone through the countryside while his wife and daughter remained behind. Summer came, hot and thick with humidity. The crops grew tall in the fields around Ithaca, and the surface of Cayuga Lake lay smooth as glass in the breathless air. Harriet's mother visited and found her daughter looking worn, older than her 21 years, moving through the house like someone who had forgotten how to rest. The baby Priscilla was healthy, thriving despite the heat, but there was something wrong that could not be named. Something in the atmosphere of that wooden house that made visitors uncomfortable and eager to leave. In July, Harriet's brother stopped by the house and found Edward Rulloff alone, reading in the parlour. When he asked where Harriet and the baby were, Rulloff replied that they had gone to visit relatives. But the brother knew of no such visit, and when he inquired which relatives, Rulloff's answer was vague, dismissive. The brother left troubled, but he had no grounds to press the matter further. It was not unusual for wives to visit family with their children, particularly in the summer months when travel was easier. But Harriet Schutt Rulloff did not return. Days passed, then weeks, and still there was no sign of the young mother and her infant daughter. Edward Rulloff continued his practice as though nothing were amiss. When patients or students asked after his wife, he said she was staying with family, that the visit was extending longer than anticipated, that she would return when she was ready. His manner was calm, undisturbed, as though the absence of his wife and child were the most natural thing in the world. Harriet's father rode to Ithaca and confronted his son-in-law directly. Where was his daughter? Where was his grandchild? Edward Rulloff met William Schutt's gaze with those pale, cold eyes and repeated the story. Harriet had taken the baby to visit relatives in the western part of the state. She had wished for a change of scenery, for the company of other women, for a respite from the confines of the small house. She would write soon, he assured the older man. There was no cause for concern, but no letters came. Harriet's mother wrote to every relative they possessed, asking if Harriet and Priscilla had arrived, if anyone had seen them. The answers came back negative, puzzled, alarmed. No one had seen Harriet Rulloff. No one had received a visit from the young mother and her infant daughter. It was as though they had simply vanished from the face of the earth, leaving behind only the questions that grew more urgent with each passing day. August turned to September, and still Edward Rulloff maintained his story. He showed no distress, no anxiety, no fear for his missing wife and child. He continued his work, saw his patients, taught his classes in Greek and Latin, and at night, in the house that had once held a family, he sat alone with his books and his notebooks, writing in the candlelight, constructing theories about language and meaning while the world outside his window darkened, and the first autumn winds began to blow across the empty fields. Subchapter 3. The Vanishing. The autumn of 1844 brought frost early to the Finger Lakes region, and with it came a gathering sense of wrongness in the small communities around Ithaca. Harriet Rulloff and her infant daughter had been gone for 3 months now, and the explanations offered by Edward Rulloff had begun to collapse under the weight of their own inconsistencies. The story changed depending on who asked and when. Sometimes Harriet was visiting relatives in the West. Sometimes she'd gone to Ohio. Once, to a particularly persistent neighbour, Rulloff suggested she had travelled to Pennsylvania. The destination shifted like smoke, but the result remained the same. No one had seen her, no one had heard from her, and no letters arrived to confirm any part of her husband's account. William Schutt was not a sophisticated man, but neither was he a fool. He gathered his sons and his sons-in-law and rode to Ithaca with the grim determination of a father who knows in his bones that something terrible has occurred. They arrived at the house where Edward Rulloff lived alone now, and they demanded answers with voices that carried the threat of violence should those answers prove unsatisfactory. Edward Rulloff received them in his parlour, that same room where Harriet had once sat quietly while he read. He was calm, almost serene, as though the arrival of angry men at his door were a minor interruption rather than a reckoning. He explained with patient precision that Harriet had left of her own accord. She had been unhappy, he said, She had found the life of a doctor's wife too confining, too isolated, too far removed from the society of women her own age. She had taken the child and departed to begin a new life elsewhere, and she had made clear that she did not wish to be followed or contacted. The Schutt men did not believe him. They searched the house looking for evidence, for some sign of struggle or violence, for anything that might confirm their suspicions. They found Edward Rulloff's books and papers, his medical instruments, his jars of preserved specimens. They found the notebooks filled with linguistic theories and strange diagrams, but they found no trace of Harriet or Priscilla, no blood, no indication of harm done within those walls. William Schutt stood in his son-in-law's parlour and stared at the man who'd married his daughter. He did not know what to do with his certainty, his bone-deep conviction that Edward Rulloff had murdered Harriet and the baby. There was no proof, no evidence that would satisfy a court of law. There was only the absence, the silence, and the cold eyes of the man who claimed his wife had simply walked away from her family and chosen to disappear. The Schutt family took their concerns to the local authorities. The constable listened to their story, noted the suspicious circumstances, but could do nothing without evidence of a crime. A wife leaving her husband was not illegal, however unusual it might be. Without a body, without witnesses, without any proof that harm had come to Harriet Rulloff, the law had no grounds to act. The constable promised to make inquiries, to alert other jurisdictions, to watch Edward Rulloff for any further suspicious behaviour. But for now there was nothing to be done. Edward Rulloff continued his life as though the accusations meant nothing. He saw patients, though fewer now than before, as rumours spread through the community. He taught his students, though parents began to reconsider whether they wished their sons to be educated by a man suspected of murdering his wife. He walked alone in the evenings, his hands clasped behind his back, his head bent in thought, apparently undisturbed by the whispers that followed him wherever he went. In November, a farmer found a woman's shawl near the shore of Cayuga Lake, tangled in the roots of a willow tree about 3 miles north of Ithaca. The fabric was water-stained and torn, but William Schutt's wife recognised it immediately as belonging to Harriet. She had sewn it herself, a blue wool shawl with a particular pattern of stitching along the hem. The discovery reignited the investigation, such as it was. Men dragged the shallows near where the shawl was found, pulling up lakeweed and mud, but nothing else. The deeper waters remained unsearched, too vast and dark for the limited resources of a small community. Edward Rulloff was questioned again. He claimed no knowledge of the shawl, suggested that Harriet must have dropped it during one of their walks before her departure. His story remained consistent in its broad outlines while shifting in its details, a technique that frustrated his questioners, but gave them nothing solid to grasp. He was willing to talk, even eager to explain, but his explanations led nowhere, circled back on themselves, created the impression of cooperation while offering no actual information. Winter settled over the region, and the lake froze at its edges. Snow covered the roads and fields, and the investigation into Harriet Rulloff's disappearance stalled along with the season. Edward Rulloff spent that winter largely alone in his house, his practice reduced to almost nothing, his students gone to other teachers. He had money saved from better times, enough to survive the cold months without income, and he had his work, his endless pursuit of linguistic patterns, his notebooks filling with theories that no one else would read or understand. The people of Ithaca watched him. They saw the lamplight burning late in his windows. They saw him walking to the market for supplies, his coat pulled tight against the wind, his expression distant and preoccupied. Some believed he was a murderer who had escaped justice through cleverness and the absence of proof. Others thought him merely strange, a man whose wife had indeed left him, driven away by his coldness and obsession with learning. But no one befriended him now. No one invited him to their homes or sought his company. He had become a ghost in the community, present but isolated, moving through the world without connection to anyone around him. Spring came again, the ice breaking on Cayuga Lake with sounds like distant thunder. The roads turned to mud, and the world grew green once more. It was April of 1845, nearly a year since Harriet and Priscilla Rulloff had vanished, and William Schutt had not given up his search for answers. He hired men to drag the lake more thoroughly, focusing on the area where the shawl had been found. Day after day, they worked the cold waters, pulling up debris and detritus from the lake bottom. On the 15th of April, their hooks caught something heavy. They hauled it slowly to the surface, the rope straining with the weight. What emerged from the water was a trunk, old and waterlogged, bound with rope and weighted with stones that had been tied to its exterior. The men dragged it to shore and broke the lock with a hammer and chisel. Inside, wrapped in canvas that had partly rotted away, were human remains. The flesh was largely gone, consumed by water and time and the creatures that lived in the lake's depths. But enough remained to identify two bodies, one of an adult, one of an infant. The adult's skull showed evidence of trauma, fractures consistent with violent blows. The infant's remains were too damaged to determine cause of death with certainty, but the fact of the body's presence in that trunk, weighted and sunk, spoke clearly enough of murder. William Schutt identified the remains as those of his daughter and granddaughter through small details that had survived the water: a ring that Harriet had worn, a piece of fabric from the infant's clothing that her grandmother had made. The discovery brought no relief, only the terrible confirmation of what the family had known in their hearts since the previous summer. Harriet Rulloff and her daughter Priscilla had not left to start a new life. They had been killed and hidden in the dark waters of the lake, and there was only one person who could have put them there. Edward Rulloff was arrested on the 18th of April, 1845. The constable and several men came to his house at dawn and found him awake already, sitting at his desk with a Greek text open before him. He offered no resistance. Asked only if he might bring some of his books and papers with him, the request was denied. He was taken to the county jail in Ithaca, charged with the murder of his wife and infant daughter, and locked in a cell to await trial. The trial took place in June of that year, and it was the most sensational event the region had seen in a generation. The courtroom was packed with spectators who came from miles around to see the educated murderer, to hear the evidence, to witness justice being done or thwarted. Edward Rulloff sat calmly throughout the proceedings, occasionally taking notes, sometimes appearing more interested in the legal arguments than in his own fate. The prosecution presented the evidence: the bodies in the trunk, the weighted stones, the rope, the shawl found months earlier. They called witnesses who testified to Rulloff's cold demeanour, to Harriet's apparent fear in the months before she vanished, to the changing stories he had told about her whereabouts. They argued that Edward Rulloff had murdered his wife and child, likely because he found them an inconvenience to his studies and his ambitions, and had disposed of their bodies in the lake with the same calculated precision he brought to all his endeavours. The defence argued that the bodies could not be positively identified, that the evidence was circumstantial, that no witness had seen Edward Rulloff commit any act of violence. They suggested that Harriet might have met with foul play at the hands of someone else, that her husband was being condemned based on suspicion rather than proof. Edward Rulloff himself declined to testify, which was his right, but the decision left questions unanswered and doubt unresolved. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. When they returned, their verdict was guilty of murder. The judge sentenced Edward Howard Rulloff to be hanged by the neck until dead, the execution to take place within 60 days. The condemned man heard the sentence without visible emotion. He nodded slightly, as though acknowledging a logical conclusion, and was led back to his cell to await his appointment with the rope. But Edward Rulloff's story did not end on the gallows that summer. His lawyers filed appeals, arguing procedural errors in the trial, questioning the identification of the remains, raising enough doubt to stay the execution. The case wound its way through higher courts while Rulloff sat in his cell, reading, writing, continuing his linguistic studies as though he were a scholar in a library rather than a condemned murderer waiting to die. The appeals process took months, then years. The sentence was overturned on technical grounds and a new trial ordered. But before that trial could take place, before the state could bring Edward Rulloff before a jury a second time, the prisoner escaped from the county jail in the summer of 1846, slipping away in the night through methods never fully explained, vanishing into the wider world beyond Ithaca and Cayuga Lake. The Schutt family buried what remained of Harriet and Priscilla in the Methodist churchyard where Harriet had been married less than 2 years before. The graves were marked with simple stones bearing their names and the dates of their births and deaths, though the death dates were estimates, guesses based on when they had last been seen alive. William Schutt stood at the graveside while the minister spoke words about dust and resurrection, and he wept for his daughter and his granddaughter, who had been taken from the world by a man who valued his books more than their lives. And Edward Rulloff walked free, somewhere beyond the reach of justice, carrying with him his notebooks and his theories and the cold intelligence that had already made him a murderer and would in time make him something more. Chapter 4: The Lake's Secret. The waters of Cayuga Lake held their secrets with the patience of the ancient world. The lake stretched 38 miles from north to south, carved by glaciers in ages past when ice sheets ground across the landscape and shaped the valleys and ridges of what would become New York. Its waters ran deep, in places descending 400 feet below the surface where light never reached and cold currents moved in darkness. What fell into those depths tended to remain there, hidden from the world above, preserved or dissolved according to the nature of things submerged. The trunk that held the bodies of Harriet and Priscilla Rulloff had rested on the lake bottom for nearly a year before the dragging hooks finally caught it and brought it back to the light. In that time, the water had worked its changes on what lay within. The canvas wrapping had begun to rot, threads separating, fabric dissolving into the sediment. The flesh had softened and sloughed away, consumed by bacteria and the small creatures that fed on whatever the lake provided. What remained were bones, pieces of clothing that had been more resistant to decay, and the physical evidence of violence that even time and water could not completely erase. The medical examination of the remains fell to Dr. James Parmalee, a physician from Ithaca who had known Harriet Rulloff slightly during her brief life as a married woman. He conducted his examination in a shed behind the courthouse, working by the light of oil lamps while a clerk took notes and the county coroner looked on. Parmalee was methodical in his approach, laying out each bone, cataloguing each piece of evidence, measuring and recording with the precision expected of medical science in the mid-19th century. The adult skeleton was incomplete. Several smaller bones were missing, lost in the lake or fallen away when the trunk was brought to shore, but enough remained to establish basic facts. The skull showed fractures on the left side, 2 distinct impacts that had cracked the temporal bone and would certainly have been fatal. The ribs showed no signs of trauma, suggesting the blows to the head had been the primary cause of death. The pelvic bones confirmed that the remains were those of a female who had given birth, consistent with Harriet Rulloff's age and history. The infant's remains told a more difficult story. The bones were so small, so fragile, that determining cause of death with certainty was nearly impossible. There were no obvious fractures, no clear signs of violence, but absence of evidence was not evidence of absence. A child could be smothered, drowned, poisoned, killed in ways that left no mark on bone. Dr. Parmalee wrote in his report that death had probably occurred close to the same time as the mother's murder, and that the child had likely been killed to prevent her from bearing witness or being discovered alone. The trunk itself provided additional evidence of premeditation. It was an old piece of luggage, well made, with leather straps and brass fittings. Someone had taken care in its preparation, boring holes in the bottom to allow water to enter and speed the sinking, tying stones to the exterior to provide additional weight. The rope used was new, strong hemp of the type sold in general stores throughout the region. The knots were neat, competent, tied by someone who understood the principles of securing a load. William Schutt identified his daughter's remains through a gold ring that had remained on one of the finger bones. He had given Harriet that ring on her 16th birthday, a simple band with her initials engraved on the interior. He held the ring in his weathered hand and wept while the coroner watched in uncomfortable silence. The identification of Priscilla came through fragments of a blue cotton dress that matched a garment her grandmother had sewn for the child in the weeks before the disappearance. The fabric had survived better than the flesh, and though stained and rotted, the particular pattern of stitching was unmistakable. The discovery of the bodies transformed the case from a mystery to a murder. Now there was physical evidence, proof that Harriet and Priscilla Rulloff had not simply left to start a new life elsewhere. They had been killed, concealed, disposed of with a calculated planning that suggested a mind unclouded by passion or panic. The authorities began to reconstruct what must have happened in the summer of 1844, piecing together a narrative from the fragmentary evidence available. Edward Rulloff had likely killed his wife and daughter in the house they shared near Ithaca. The blows to Harriet's skull suggested a weapon, probably something heavy and blunt, a hammer perhaps, or a piece of firewood, though no such weapon was ever found. The murder had probably occurred at night, when the neighbours would not hear, when the darkness would conceal any activity afterward. Rulloff would have had to work quickly, to wrap the bodies in canvas, to place them in the trunk, to load the trunk onto some form of conveyance that could transport it to the lake. The distance from his house to the place where the trunk was found was approximately 3 miles. A strong man could have managed the journey with a handcart or wagon, travelling by night, choosing a secluded spot along the shore where he could sink the trunk without being observed. The logistics required planning, strength, and a certain coldness of purpose. Edward Rulloff possessed all three in abundance, but why had he done it? This question troubled those who tried to understand the crime. Harriet had been young, obedient, seemingly devoted to her husband. The child had been healthy, no burden beyond what any infant represented. What had driven Edward Rulloff to murder his own family? Some believed it was the simple inconvenience they represented. Rulloff was a man obsessed with his intellectual pursuits, impatient with anything that distracted him from his studies. A wife and child required attention, made demands on his time and resources, interrupted the solitary focus he needed for his work. In this theory, the murders were acts of practical elimination, removing obstacles to the life he wished to lead. Others saw something darker, more pathological. They pointed to Rulloff's cold demeanour, his apparent lack of human feeling, the way he had spoken of his missing wife without emotional concern. Perhaps he was simply incapable of the normal bonds of affection that connected most people to their families. Perhaps he had killed them because he felt nothing for them, because their existence meant less to him than the contents of his notebooks. A third theory suggested that Harriet had discovered something about her husband's past, some secret or crime that had driven him to silence her permanently. This idea gained traction among those who noted how little was known about Edward Rulloff's life before his arrival in New York. Where had he truly come from? What had he done before claiming to be a physician? The lack of answers to these questions suggested a past that would not bear examination, and perhaps Harriet had learned too much for her own safety. The truth, whatever it was, had died with Harriet and Priscilla, or remained locked in Edward Rulloff's mind. And Rulloff himself, after his escape from the county jail, had vanished into the vastness of America, beyond the reach of those who sought answers or justice, or simple human understanding of how a man could kill his wife, an infant daughter, and then return to his Greek texts as though nothing of consequence had occurred. The lake kept other secrets still. The dragging operations continued sporadically for months after the discovery of the trunk, motivated partly by thoroughness and partly by the hope of finding additional evidence. The murder weapon, perhaps, or other items Rulloff might have disposed of in the water. The hooks and nets pulled up the ordinary debris of lakeside life, old tools, broken furniture, fish bones and shells. but nothing else connected to the murders emerged from those dark waters. Cayuga Lake was part of the Haudenosaunee homeland, territory of the Cayuga people, before they were displaced by European settlers and their descendants. The native peoples had considered the lake sacred, a source of life and mystery, and they had told stories of spirits dwelling in its depths. Now it was American, mapped and measured and busy with boats and commerce, but the water remembered everything that had entered it, and sometimes, on still mornings when mist rose from the surface, the people who lived along its shores thought about all that lay beneath, all the secrets submerged and hidden and waiting. The graves of Harriet and Priscilla Rulloff stood in the Methodist churchyard on a gentle slope that overlooked the valley. Wildflowers grew around the stones in summer, and snow covered them in winter, and the seasons passed as they always did, indifferent to grief. William Schutt visited the graves regularly until his own death years later, and he never stopped wondering what his daughter's last moments had been like, whether she had known what was coming, whether she had tried to plead for her life or for the life of her child. The water flowed on, cold and deep. The lake held what it had been given, and would hold it still, long after everyone who remembered Harriet Rulloff had themselves passed into earth and silence. This was the nature of such places. They witnessed and concealed, they preserved and destroyed, and they offered no judgment on the acts of men who used them as graves for those they had murdered. Edward Rulloff had chosen the lake because it was convenient and because he believed it would keep his secrets, and for nearly a year it had done exactly that, until circumstance and persistence brought his crime back to the surface. But there were other lakes, other places where bodies could be hidden, and Rulloff was free now, walking under different names through different towns, and no one knew what other secrets he might create or where he might choose to conceal them. The investigation eventually closed, its central questions answered as fully as they could be, without the murderer himself to provide final testimony. The authorities issued warrants for Edward Rulloff's arrest in multiple jurisdictions, circulated descriptions, alerted law enforcement agencies across New York and neighbouring states. But the country was vast, and a man with intelligence and education could disappear into it, reinvent himself, create new identities as easily as he created theories about language. The people of Ithaca tried to return to their ordinary lives, but the shadow of the murders lay across the community. They had welcomed a stranger, and he had killed his family in their midst, and the knowledge troubled them. They became more wary of outsiders, more careful in their trust, more attentive to the signs of wrongness that they now believed they should have seen earlier in Edward Rulloff's behaviour. And somewhere beyond their sight, beyond the reach of their justice, the man who had killed Harriet and Priscilla Rulloff continued his life, continued his studies, continued building the strange and terrible legacy that would eventually bring him back to public attention decades later, when he would kill again and face judgment once more for crimes that revealed the depths of his particular form of monstrosity. Chapter 5. The Scholar in Chains. The Auburn State Prison stood like a monument to punishment on the edge of Cayuga Lake, its grey stone walls rising 30 feet above the surrounding landscape. Built in the early years of the 19th century, Auburn was one of the first prisons in America to implement what reformers called the congregate system. Prisoners worked together during the day in absolute silence, then returned to individual cells at night where they remained in solitary darkness until morning. The regime was intended to break the criminal spirit through discipline and isolation, to remake men through suffering and obedience to strict routine. It was to Auburn that Edward Rulloff was eventually sent, though not for the murders of his wife and daughter. His escape from the county jail in 1846 had been successful enough to keep him free for several years, but freedom for a man like Rulloff was always conditional, always temporary. He had fled south into Pennsylvania, adopting the name Edward Howard and finding work as a teacher in small academies where his knowledge of classical languages made him valuable despite his reticence about his past. But Edward Rulloff could not escape his own nature. In 1848 he was arrested in Meadville, Pennsylvania, for attempting to pass forged bank drafts. The crime was clumsy, uncharacteristic of his usual careful planning, and suggested either desperation or the arrogance of a man who believed his intelligence placed him above consequence. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to 2 years in the Western Penitentiary in Pittsburgh. It was during this imprisonment that New York authorities learned of his whereabouts. When his sentence in Pennsylvania was complete, he was extradited back to New York to face charges for prison escape and other crimes related to his flight from justice. The murder charges could not be refiled because of legal technicalities involving the first trial's reversal, a frustration that haunted the Schutt family, but could not be remedied under the laws of the time. Edward Rulloff entered Auburn State Prison in November of 1850, a convict now rather than a gentleman scholar. He was 34 years old, still slender, his dark hair beginning to show threads of grey. The prison barber cut his hair short in the regulation style, and he was issued the striped uniform that marked all prisoners, and he was assigned to a cell that measured 7 feet long by 3 feet wide, with a narrow cot, a bucket, and nothing else. The Auburn system demanded silence. Prisoners were forbidden to speak to one another during work hours. They marched in lockstep, one hand on the shoulder of the man ahead, eyes downcast, mouths closed. Any violation of the silence rule was met with punishment, the lash, the dark cell, reduction in rations. The prison operated like a vast machine designed to grind the humanity out of those it held, to reduce men to obedient automatons who worked without complaint and thought without hope. But Edward Rulloff was not a man who could be easily ground down. Within weeks of his arrival, he had begun to make himself useful to the prison administration in ways that earned him small privileges. He could read and write with facility, skills that many of the guards lacked, and he offered his services as a clerk, helping to maintain records and correspondence. The warden, recognizing the value of an educated prisoner, allowed Rulloff to work in the prison office rather than in the workshops, where most convicts laboured at making shoes or barrels or furniture. The work gave Rulloff access to paper, ink and books. The prison maintained a small library for the moral improvement of inmates, mostly religious texts and improving literature, but it was better than nothing. Rulloff read everything available, often multiple times, memorizing passages, analyzing arguments, treating even the most pedestrian moral tracts as subjects worthy of scholarly attention. But reading what others had written was not enough. Edward Rulloff needed to pursue his own work, the linguistic theories that had occupied his mind even during his trial for murder. He began to request specific books through the prison chaplain, claiming they were necessary for his spiritual development. He asked for Greek and Latin grammars, for Sanskrit texts, for comparative studies of ancient languages. The chaplain, impressed by the prisoner's apparent dedication to learning and self-improvement, approved many of these requests, and gradually Rulloff assembled a small collection of scholarly works in his cell. At night, after the gas lamps in the corridors were turned down and the prison descended into darkness, Edward Rulloff sat on his narrow cot and worked by the light of a candle stub he had obtained through trade with a guard. He wrote in notebooks purchased from the prison commissary with money earned through his clerical work. His handwriting was small and precise, filling every inch of paper with dense columns of words in multiple languages, with diagrams showing relationships between roots and derivatives, with elaborate theories about the common origin of all human speech. Rulloff believed he had discovered something fundamental about language, something that scholars had missed for centuries. He was convinced that all languages derived from a single source, and that by analysing the patterns of sound and meaning across different tongues, he could reconstruct the original human language. The speech of Adam in Eden, or its equivalent in whatever cosmology one preferred. It was work that consumed him completely, that made the years of imprisonment bearable because they gave him uninterrupted time to think and write without the distractions of ordinary life. The other prisoners regarded Edward Rulloff with a mixture of suspicion and awe. He spoke to no one unless necessary, following the silence rule more strictly than most because he had no interest in the petty concerns and crude conversations of his fellow convicts. But word spread through the prison population that the quiet man in the striped uniform was a scholar, a man of learning, perhaps even a genius. Some of the prisoners who could read asked him for help with letters to their families, and he obliged, writing their crude thoughts in elegant sentences, never judging, never commenting, simply providing the service requested before returning to his own work. The guards found him strange but manageable. He caused no trouble, participated in no fights, attempted no escapes. He followed orders with mechanical precision, did his work competently, and retreated into his books and notebooks whenever allowed. The warden occasionally asked him to perform special tasks, translating a document in French, writing a letter requiring educated phrasing, tutoring the warden's own son in Latin grammar. Rulloff complied with these requests, his manner always polite, always distant, never revealing what he thought of his captors or his situation. Years passed in this way. Edward Rulloff celebrated his 40th birthday in his cell at Auburn, marking the occasion by completing a section of his linguistic manuscript that he believed proved the connection between Sanskrit and Greek through previously unrecognized sound shifts. He had no birthday cake, no company, no acknowledgement from anyone else that he had reached this milestone, but he had his work, and that was sufficient. The outside world changed while Edward Rulloff remained locked away. The 1850s saw increasing tensions over slavery, the rise of new political parties, the transformation of America from a largely rural society to one increasingly shaped by railroads and industry and urban growth. None of this touched the grey walls of Auburn Prison, where time moved according to the rhythm of bells and whistles that mark the divisions of the day: wake, work, meals, sleep, and again in endless repetition. Rulloff's sentence was 10 years for prison escape and related charges. He served it without incident, accumulating good behaviour credits that might have shortened his term had he been interested in such things. But Edward Rulloff seemed in no hurry to leave prison. He had food, shelter, and time to work on his theories. The outside world held dangers and complications, while prison offered a strange kind of freedom, the freedom from choice, from the need to support himself, from the social demands that he had always found burdensome. In the spring of 1860, Edward Rulloff was released from Auburn State Prison. He walked out through the gates carrying a small bundle containing his manuscripts, a few books he had been allowed to keep, and the clothes he had worn when first imprisoned a decade earlier. He was 44 years old now, his hair more grey than dark, his frame still slender but harder, marked by years of prison diet and routine. He stood outside the walls for several minutes, adjusting to the openness of the sky, the absence of stone barriers in every direction. The warden had offered him advice upon his release: find honest work, stay away from cities where temptation flourished, perhaps seek the counsel of a minister who could help him maintain the moral improvement he had supposedly achieved during his imprisonment. Edward Rulloff listened to this advice with the same polite detachment he had shown throughout his incarceration, thanked the warden for his concern, and walked away toward the road that led south. He had no intention of following any of the warden's suggestions. He had spent 10 years in prison not for the murders of his wife and daughter, but for the lesser crime of escaping justice. The world believed he had been punished, reformed, prepared for reintegration into society. But Edward Rulloff knew himself better than the world knew him. He was the same man who had killed Harriet and Priscilla, the same man who valued his intellectual pursuits above human life, the same man who recognized no moral authority beyond his own reason. The years in prison had taught him important lessons. He had learned patience, learned to appear cooperative while pursuing his own ends, learned to manipulate the system to gain small advantages that accumulated over time. He had also learned that his linguistic work, his theories about the origin of language, could be used to create a kind of respectability, a scholarly identity that might shield him from scrutiny while he pursued other activities. Edward Rulloff walked south from Auburn with his manuscripts under his arm, and his mind already planning the next phase of his life. He would need money, a new identity, a place where his past was not known. He would need to continue his scholarly work while finding ways to support himself that did not require the tedious routine of honest employment. And he would need to be more careful this time, more calculating in his crimes, more attentive to the details that had led to his previous capture. The road stretched before him, dust rising from his feet as he walked. The spring sun was warm on his shoulders, and somewhere in the distance, a bird sang in a tree whose name he knew in both English and Latin. Edward Rulloff smiled slightly, a cold expression that touched his lips but never reached his eyes, and continued walking toward whatever waited beyond the horizon. Behind him, the grey walls of Auburn prison stood silent and implacable, already forgetting the scholar in chains who had spent a decade within them, already preparing for the next wave of convicts who would march through those gates seeking redemption, or at least survival. The prison kept its records, noted the date of Edward Rulloff's release, filed the information away in ledgers that would gather dust in storage rooms for decades to come, and somewhere ahead, in cities and towns that did not yet know his name, other victims waited, other crimes would unfold, and the man who had killed his wife and daughter would prove that prison had changed nothing fundamental about his nature, only refined his methods and deepened his contempt for the laws that attempted to constrain him. Chapter 6. The Escape and the Alias. Edward Rulloff emerged from prison into a nation on the edge of transformation. The year was 1860, and the presidential election that fall would bring Abraham Lincoln to power and set in motion the chain of events that would tear the country apart. But political upheaval meant little to a man whose concerns centered on his own survival and the continuation of his scholarly work. Rulloff needed money, shelter, and a new identity that would allow him to move through the world without attracting the attention of those who might remember his past. He made his way east from Auburn, travelling on foot when necessary, paying for passage on canal boats and railroads when he had coin enough. He avoided Ithaca and the Finger Lakes region where his crimes were still remembered, where the Schutt family still lived and grieved, where his face might be recognised despite the years that had passed. Instead, he drifted through the smaller towns and cities of central New York, offering his services as a tutor and teacher, always moving on before anyone could inquire too deeply into his background. In the town of Cortland, he found work teaching Latin and Greek to the teenage son of a merchant, who hoped education might make a gentleman of the boy. Rulloff introduced himself as Edward Luriot, a scholar who had recently immigrated from Europe and was seeking to establish himself in America. The false name was not random. Luriot was close enough to his real name to respond to naturally, but different enough to deflect casual investigation. The merchant, impressed by Rulloff's obvious learning and apparent refinement, asked few questions and paid reasonable wages. For several months, Edward Rulloff maintained this respectable existence. He lived in a boarding house, taught his student daily, and spent his evenings working on his linguistic manuscripts. But respectability did not pay well, and the life of a small-town tutor offered neither the income nor the stimulation that Rulloff's ambitions required. He began to consider other means of supporting himself, means that would allow him to pursue his scholarship without the burden of constant employment. In the spring of 1861, as the nation descended into civil war, Edward Rulloff committed his first burglary since his release from prison. The target was a dry goods store in Cortland, and the method was simple. He entered through a rear window during the night hours, removed cash from the till, and selected items of value from the inventory, and departed without detection. The theft was discovered the next morning, but there were no witnesses, no evidence pointing to any particular suspect. The local authorities investigated perfunctorily and concluded that some transient had been responsible. The success of this venture encouraged Edward Rulloff to continue. He began studying the patterns of commerce and security in the towns he visited, noting which establishments held cash overnight, which locks were poorly maintained, which proprietors were careless about securing their premises. He approached burglary with the same methodical intelligence he applied to linguistics, treating each theft as a problem to be solved through observation, planning, and precise execution. But Edward Rulloff understood that working alone limited his opportunities. Certain targets required multiple people, one to break in, another to stand watch, a third to transport stolen goods. He needed accomplices, but finding reliable partners among the criminal class presented challenges. Most thieves were crude, impulsive, lacking the discipline necessary for carefully planned operations. Rulloff needed people who could follow instructions, who would not panic under pressure, who understood that successful crime required intelligence as much as courage. He found his first partner in Syracuse, a young man named Albert Jarvis, who worked as a clerk in a hardware store and nurtured resentments about his low wages and limited prospects. Jarvis was in his mid-20s, physically strong, capable of keeping his mouth shut, and impressed by Rulloff's education and apparent sophistication. Rulloff cultivated the relationship carefully, presenting himself as a man of the world who understood how to prosper outside the constraints of honest labor. Their first job together was a store burglary in a small town south of Syracuse. Rulloff planned the operation with military precision. They would enter at 2 a.m. when the streets were empty. Jarvis would force the rear door while Rulloff kept watch. They would take only cash and small valuable items that could be easily transported and sold, and they would be gone within 15 minutes. The operation succeeded perfectly, netting them nearly $200, a substantial sum that could support both men for months if spent carefully. Albert Jarvis proved useful enough that Rulloff decided to maintain the partnership. They worked together sporadically over the next 2 years, moving through the towns and small cities of New York, occasionally venturing into Pennsylvania or Ohio when opportunities presented themselves. Between jobs, Rulloff returned to his scholarly work, spending weeks at a time in boarding houses or cheap hotels, writing and revising his linguistic theories, while Jarvis found legitimate work to avoid suspicion. The Civil War created favorable conditions for their activities. Local law enforcement was understaffed as men went to join the army. Communities were distracted by news from the battlefields, by the lists of dead and wounded that appeared in newspapers, by the political controversies that divided families and neighbours. In this atmosphere of disruption and anxiety, a few burglaries attracted less attention than they might have in more settled times. Edward Rulloff adopted multiple aliases during these years. He was Edward Lurio when he taught languages, James Nelson when he worked as a clerk, Edward Howard when he needed to present a more American identity. He kept the details of each identity consistent enough to be believable, but vague enough to resist detailed investigation. He claimed to be from different European countries depending on which accent he chose to affect: German, Swiss, French. The truth of his origins mattered less than the impression of exotic learning and sophistication. In 1863, Rulloff and Jarvis recruited a third partner, a man named William Dexter, who had worked as a machinist before losing his position due to drink. Dexter was older than Jarvis, more experienced in the rough edges of life, less impressed by Rulloff's intellectual pretensions. But he was competent with locks and tools, and he understood the value of careful planning. The 3 men formed an effective team, with Rulloff as the strategist, Jarvis as the muscle, and Dexter providing technical expertise. They operated across a wide territory, never staying in one place long enough to establish patterns that law enforcement could detect. Rulloff maintained strict rules about their activities. They avoided residential burglaries, which carried heavier penalties and greater moral opprobrium. They never used violence unless absolutely necessary for escape. They spent their proceeds carefully, avoiding the conspicuous consumption that had undone so many criminals. And they maintained separate lives between jobs, coming together only for specific operations and then dispersing again into their various identities. Edward Rulloff's linguistic work continued throughout this period. He carried his manuscripts with him constantly, adding to them during quiet periods, refining his arguments. constructing ever more elaborate theories about the relationships between languages. He began to imagine that his work might eventually be published, that he might gain recognition in scholarly circles for his discoveries. The irony of a burglar and murderer contributing to academic knowledge did not escape him, but neither did it trouble him. He saw no contradiction between his criminal activities and his intellectual pursuits. Both were simply means of asserting his superiority over the common mass of humanity that lived according to rules he found arbitrary and restrictive. By 1865, as the Civil War drew to its bloody conclusion, Edward Rulloff had become one of the most successful burglars operating in the northeastern states. He had never been caught for any of the crimes committed since his release from Auburn prison. He had accumulated enough money to support himself comfortably during the periods when he concentrated on his scholarly work, and he had developed a network of fences and contacts who could dispose of stolen goods without asking inconvenient questions about their origin. But success bred overconfidence. Edward Rulloff began to believe that his intelligence made him invulnerable, that he had perfected the art of crime to a degree that placed him beyond the reach of ordinary law enforcement. He started taking greater risks, targeting more valuable establishments, staying in communities longer than was prudent, and he failed to recognize that his partners, particularly William Dexter, were growing careless, drinking more heavily, talking more freely about their activities when they should have maintained silence. The arrest, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. In the autumn of 1865, a clerk in a Buffalo store noticed William Dexter attempting to sell items that matched the description of goods stolen from a recent burglary. The clerk alerted police, who followed Dexter and eventually arrested all three men when they gathered to divide the proceeds from another job. Edward Rulloff was taken into custody using his current alias of James Nelson, and for several days, the authorities did not realize they had captured a man wanted for murder in another jurisdiction more than 15 years earlier. The discovery of his true identity came through chance. A deputy sheriff from Tompkins County happened to be in Buffalo on unrelated business and saw the prisoner being transported to his cell. Something in the man's face sparked a memory, and the deputy made inquiries that eventually revealed James Nelson was in fact Edward Rulloff, the scholar who had murdered his wife and daughter and escaped from custody in 1846. The revelation transformed what might have been a routine burglary case into a sensation. Newspapers across New York published accounts of Rulloff's capture, recounting the murders of Harriet and Priscilla, describing his years in prison and his subsequent career as a burglar and gang leader. The story had everything readers loved: violence, mystery, education twisted to criminal purpose, the idea that evil could wear the mask of refinement and learning. Edward Rulloff was held without bail while authorities determined which jurisdiction would try him first. Buffalo wanted him for the recent burglaries. Tompkins County wanted him for prison escape, and there were those who argued he should face trial again for the murders, though the legal complications made this uncertain. In the end, he was tried in Buffalo for burglary and receiving stolen goods, convicted on clear evidence, and sentenced to another term at Auburn State Prison. He returned to that grey stone fortress in the winter of 1865, 12 years older than when he had last walked out its gates, but fundamentally unchanged. The warden recognized him and assigned him to the same work in the prison office that he had performed during his previous incarceration. And Edward Rulloff settled once more into the routine of prison life, already planning how he might use his time to advance his scholarly work and dreaming of the day when he would once again walk free. Chapter 7. The Burglar's Mind. Auburn State Prison received Edward Rulloff for the second time with the weary resignation of an institution that had seen every variety of human failure. The guards who processed him remembered his previous stay, remembered the quiet scholar who had spent a decade filling notebooks with linguistic theories, while other prisoners broke under the weight of silence and routine. They assigned him the same striped uniform, the same type of narrow cell, but this time the warden placed restrictions on his access to books and writing materials. There had been complaints from the previous administration that Rulloff had been given too much privilege, that his scholarly pursuits had made him arrogant and contemptuous of prison discipline. But Edward Rulloff had learned patience during his first imprisonment, and he applied those lessons now. He worked without complaint in the prison workshops, performing whatever labour was assigned with mechanical efficiency. He spoke to no one unless spoken to, followed every rule with exaggerated precision, presented himself as a model of reformed behaviour, and gradually, month by month, he earned back small privileges. First a book from the prison library, then permission to write letters, finally access to paper and ink for what he claimed were religious reflections. His sentence this time was 5 years for burglary and related offences. Albert Jarvis and William Dexter received similar terms, though they were sent to different institutions to prevent them from planning future crimes together. The newspapers had made much of the educated burglar, the man who could recite Homer in Greek while planning to rob a dry goods store. Editorial writers debated what Rulloff's case said about American society, about the relationship between learning and morality, about whether education refined the soul or simply gave criminals more sophisticated tools for their depredations. Edward Rulloff ignored the commentary. He cared nothing for public opinion or moral philosophy. His concerns were practical: how to survive his sentence with his mind intact, how to continue his linguistic work under restrictive conditions, and how to plan for the future when he would once again be free to pursue his goals without the interference of law or conscience. The years from 1866 to 1870 passed slowly within Auburn's walls. The nation outside underwent reconstruction, struggled with the aftermath of civil war, expanded westward with railroad and telegraph. Inside the prison, time moved, according to the unchanging rhythm of bells and locked doors and the shuffle of feet in striped uniforms. Edward Rulloff marked the seasons by the quality of light that fell through his cell's high window, by the temperature of the stone walls, by the particular silences that distinguished winter from summer, in that place where silence was the constant rule. He turned 50 in prison, an age when most men began to think of grandchildren and the approaching end of their working years. But Edward Rulloff had no family, no legacy except the manuscripts he continued to produce in secret, writing in tiny script on whatever paper he could obtain, hiding the pages in his cell's few crevices, adding constantly to his theories about language even as his body grew older and his eyes began to weaken from years of reading by insufficient light. In the spring of 1870, Edward Rulloff was released from Auburn State Prison for the second time. He was 54 years old, grey-haired now, his frame still slender but marked by the years of confinement. The warden offered the same advice as before: seek honest work, avoid cities, find religion, or at least the appearance of moral reform. And Rulloff listened with the same polite detachment, thanked the authorities for their concern, and walked out through the prison gates carrying his small bundle of belongings and his precious manuscripts. He made his way to New York City this time, seeking the anonymity that only large cities could provide. In the vast crowds of Manhattan, a middle-aged man with a European accent and educated manners could disappear, could reinvent himself without the constant scrutiny that plagued small towns where everyone knew everyone else's business. Rulloff took rooms in a boarding house near the Bowery, a respectable enough address, but located in a neighbourhood where questions were rarely asked and past histories remained private. He needed money, and he needed it quickly. His prison savings amounted to a few dollars, barely enough for a week's rent and meals. He could seek work as a tutor or clerk, but such employment paid poorly and demanded time he wished to devote to his scholarly work. The logical alternative was to return to burglary, but working alone in an unfamiliar city presented challenges. He needed partners again, men who knew New York's geography and commercial patterns, who could identify promising targets and plan efficient operations. Edward Rulloff began frequenting the establishments where criminals gathered. certain saloons and gambling houses where thieves and confidence men conducted their business. He presented himself as an educated man fallen on hard times, a former professional willing to contribute his intelligence to well-planned operations in exchange for a fair share of proceeds. His manner was different from the rough criminals who dominated these spaces, but that difference attracted attention from men looking for someone who could provide the careful planning their enterprises lacked. He found new partners in the summer of 1870. The first was Edward Jarvis, no relation to his previous accomplice, Albert Jarvis, but a man of similar temperament, young, strong, willing to follow direction. The second was William Dexter, and here was a curious coincidence, for this was actually the same William Dexter who had been imprisoned with Rulloff 5 years earlier, released now and drawn back into criminal life for lack of other prospects. Dexter recognized Rulloff immediately, and though he had complaints about how their previous partnership had ended in arrest, he acknowledged that Rulloff's planning had made them all more successful than they would have been working independently. The three men formed a new burglary gang, with Rulloff once again serving as strategist and planner. They worked the smaller cities within a day's travel of New York, places like Newark, Yonkers, Paterson, towns large enough to have commercial districts worth robbing, but small enough that security remained relatively lax. Edward Rulloff approached each job with the same methodical intelligence that characterized all his endeavors. He studied the target location during daylight hours, noting the positions of locks and windows, observing when proprietors arrived and departed, identifying which neighboring buildings might provide cover or escape routes. The gang operated successfully through the summer and early autumn of 1870. They accumulated several $1,000s, enough that Rulloff could have retired from crime and devoted himself entirely to his scholarly work for years to come. But he did not retire. The planning and execution of burglaries had become intellectually satisfying to him in their own right. Problems to be solved through logic and observation, demonstrations of his superiority over both the victims and the law enforcement officers who failed to catch him. On the night of August 17th, 1870, Edward Rulloff and his partners travelled to Binghamton, New York, a prosperous city of 15,000 souls located where the Susquehanna and Shenango rivers met. Binghamton had grown wealthy from its position on transportation routes, and its commercial district contained numerous shops and stores that remained closed and unguarded during night hours. Rulloff had identified a particular target, a dry goods store on Water Street that reportedly kept substantial cash on the premises. The three men arrived in Binghamton by train in the late afternoon, carrying carpet bags that contained their tools and dark clothing. They took rooms at a cheap hotel near the railroad depot, ate supper at a nearby restaurant and waited for nightfall. Edward Rulloff spent the waiting hours reviewing their plan one final time with his partners, making certain everyone understood their roles, emphasizing the importance of silence and speed. They left the hotel at midnight, moving through empty streets toward the commercial district. The night was hot and humid, typical for August in central New York, and clouds covered the moon, providing the darkness they needed. Rulloff led them through alleys and side streets, avoiding the main thoroughfares where a night watchman might be making rounds. The dry goods store stood dark and silent on Water Street, its display windows reflecting nothing in the clouded night. William Dexter approached the rear door with his tools, working the lock with practiced skill while Edward Jarvis watched the street, and Rulloff stood ready with a shuttered lantern. The lock yielded after several minutes, and they entered through the back room where the proprietor stored inventory. Inside, they moved with the confidence of experienced burglars. Dexter and Jarvis began filling sacks with small, valuable items, scissors, knives, silk handkerchiefs, anything that could be easily sold. Edward Rulloff went to the front counter where the cash drawer was located, forcing it open with a pry bar, removing the bills and coins within. They had been inside perhaps 10 minutes when they heard the sound that every burglar dreads. Footsteps approaching from outside, the jingle of keys, voices speaking in low tones. Someone was coming to the store, perhaps a night watchman making rounds. perhaps the proprietor returning for something forgotten. Edward Rulloff signalled his partners to freeze, to remain absolutely silent, hoping whoever approached would pass by without entering. But the footsteps stopped at the front door. Keys rattled in the lock, and then the door opened, and two men entered carrying a lamp, and they saw the burglars standing there with their stolen goods, and their tools and their guilty presence that could not be explained or denied. What happened next occurred in seconds, though those who survived would remember it as stretching into eternity. One of the storemen shouted for help. William Dexter dropped his sack and ran toward the back door. Edward Jarvis pulled a revolver from his coat, a weapon Rulloff had not known he carried, had explicitly forbidden because violence made manhunts inevitable. Jarvis fired twice, the shots impossibly loud in the closed space of the store. The first shot missed, shattering a display case. The second struck one of the storemen in the chest and he fell backward, blood spreading across his shirt in the lamplight. The other storeman lunged at Jarvis, trying to grab the gun. They struggled, crashed into shelves, sent merchandise tumbling to the floor. Dexter had reached the back door but turned back, unwilling to abandon his partner. Edward Rulloff stood frozen, his mind racing through options, calculating odds, recognizing that everything had gone catastrophically wrong. More shots. The second storeman fell, wounded in the shoulder and leg. Edward Jarvis stumbled backward, struck in the head by a blow from something heavy, his blood joining the blood of his victims on the floor. William Dexter grabbed Rulloff's arm, pulling him toward the back door, and they ran together into the night while behind them men shouted and whistles blew, and the whole city began to wake to the sound of murder and mayhem on Water Street. They ran through alleys, through yards, away from the commercial district and toward the river. Behind them, they could hear the growing commotion, voices calling, dogs barking, the organized chaos of a manhunt beginning. William Dexter was gasping, his older body struggling with the pace. Edward Rulloff ran with the desperate energy of a man who understood perfectly what capture would mean this time. After prison twice before, after the murders of his wife and daughter, after the shooting that had just occurred in the dry goods store. They reached the river and followed it south, staying in the shadows of trees and buildings, moving as quickly as terrain and darkness allowed. Dawn found them several miles from Binghamton, exhausted, covered in mud and scratches, their clothing torn. They hid in a barn, burrowing into hay, and tried to rest while their minds replayed the disaster of the previous night. Edward Rulloff knew they would be caught. The whole region would be searching for them. The murdered men, for surely they were dead or dying, would make this a capital case. And Edward Jarvis, if he survived, would likely confess everything to save himself. The careful life of the educated burglar, the years of successful crime conducted with intelligence and planning, had ended in blood and chaos because one partner had carried a gun and used it when reason should have prevailed. 2 days later, law enforcement found them hiding in a grove of trees near the Pennsylvania border. They surrendered without resistance, too exhausted to run farther, too experienced to imagine that fighting would improve their situation. Edward Rulloff was placed in irons and transported back to Binghamton to face charges of murder, burglary, and whatever other crimes the authorities could prove against him. The newspapers would call it the crime of the century, and Edward Rulloff, scholar and murderer, would finally face the judgment that had pursued him for more than a quarter century. Chapter 8. The Night in Binghamton. The city of Binghamton in the summer of 1870 was a place of commerce and ambition. Its streets busy with the traffic of merchants and manufacturers who had prospered from the region's position at the confluence of two rivers. The Susquehanna and Chenango met here, providing water power for mills and transportation routes for goods moving between New York's interior and the markets of the East. The population had grown steadily through the decades following the Civil War, and with that growth came the establishments that marked prosperous communities: banks, hotels, theatres, churches, and rows of shops selling everything from dry goods to hardware to fine furniture imported from factories in the great cities. Water Street ran parallel to the Chenango River, and along its length stood the commercial buildings that served the daily needs of Binghamton's citizens. Among these establishments was Halbert Brothers' dry goods store, a 2-story brick structure with large display windows on the ground floor and storage space above. The Halbert brothers, Frederick and David, had operated their business for nearly 15 years, building a reputation for fair prices and quality merchandise. They employed several clerks, kept regular hours, and closed their doors each evening at 6 o'clock when the working day ended and families returned to their homes for supper. On the evening of August 17th, Frederick Halbert had locked the store as usual and gone home to his wife and children. But later that night, unable to sleep, troubled by some detail of the day's business that nagged at his mind, he decided to return to the store to check his accounts. He asked his clerk, Joseph Burroughs, to accompany him, thinking the walk would do them both good and the errand would be quickly accomplished. The two men left Halbert's house shortly before midnight, walking through streets that were dark and quiet, most of the city's residents already asleep in their beds. They arrived at the store to find the front door locked as it should be, nothing apparently amiss. Frederick Halbert inserted his key and opened the door, and Joseph Burroughs followed with a lamp held high to illuminate the interior. What they saw in that first moment of light changed everything. 3 men standing in the store amid scattered merchandise, caught in the act of robbery, frozen for an instant in surprise before the world exploded into violence. The shots came so quickly that neither Frederick Halbert nor Joseph Burroughs had time to react with anything but instinct. The first shot missed, its report deafening in the enclosed space. The second struck Frederick Halbert in the chest, the impact spinning him backward against a display counter. He felt no pain initially, only shock and the strange sensation of his legs refusing to support his weight. Joseph Burroughs lunged toward the man with the gun, driven by anger or courage or simply the reflexive need to stop what was happening. They grappled, fell against shelves, sent goods crashing to the floor. More shots. Burroughs felt fire in his shoulder, then in his leg, and he fell beside his employer while the world tilted and darkened around the edges of his vision. The burglars fled through the back door, leaving behind their tools, their stolen goods, and 2 men bleeding on the floor of the store. Frederick Halbert tried to speak but could manage only a wet, gasping sound as blood filled his lungs. Joseph Burroughs, conscious but badly wounded, dragged himself to the front door and called for help with what voice he could summon. His cries brought neighbours running, and within minutes the store was filled with people, some trying to help the wounded men, others running to alert the authorities. A doctor arrived within a quarter hour, but there was little he could do for Frederick Halbert. The bullet had pierced his lung and lodged near his spine. He died as the doctor examined him, his blood spreading across the wooden floor in a dark pool that reflected the lamplight. Joseph Burroughs was carried to his home and attended there, the doctor extracting 1 bullet from his shoulder and determining that the second had passed through his thigh without striking bone. Burroughs would survive, though he would carry scars and pain for the rest of his life. By dawn, the entire city knew of the murder on Water Street. Frederick Halbert had been well liked, a family man, a respected merchant, killed while trying to protect his own property from thieves. The crime offended every principle of order and decency that communities relied upon. It was not simply theft, which was bad enough, but murder committed in the commission of theft, violence directed against innocent men who had done nothing to deserve such treatment. The authorities organised a manhunt with remarkable speed. The sheriff deputised every able-bodied man willing to carry a gun and search for the killers. Descriptions were gathered from Joseph Burroughs, who had seen the burglars clearly in the lamplight before the shooting began. He described 3 men, one older, slender, with grey hair and an educated manner of speech, one younger, strongly built, the one who had fired the shots, and one middle-aged, rougher in appearance, who had been filling a sack with stolen goods when interrupted. Inside the store, investigators found the tools the burglars had left behind in their flight, a pry bar, a dark lantern, several sacks partially filled with merchandise. They also found something unexpected, a notebook that had fallen from someone's pocket during the struggle. The notebook contained writing in multiple languages, dense passages in Greek and Latin, and what appeared to be Sanskrit, along with diagrams and charts showing relationships between words across different tongues. It was the work of an educated man, a scholar, and it suggested that at least one of the burglars was not the common criminal the authorities might have expected. The railroad depot was watched, the roads leading out of the city were patrolled, and word was sent to surrounding communities to be alert for 3 men matching the descriptions provided. Bloodhounds were brought in, given the scent from clothing found in the hotel room where the burglars had stayed, and set loose to track their quarry through the countryside south of Binghamton. Edward Rulloff and William Dexter had not gotten far. Exhausted from their flight, lacking food or adequate rest, they were found on the morning of August 19th hiding in a grove of trees about 15 miles from Binghamton. They surrendered to the armed men who surrounded them, offering no resistance, saying nothing beyond their names, false names, though those would be corrected soon enough when their true identities were established. Edward Jarvis, the one who had fired the shots that killed Frederick Halbert and wounded Joseph Burroughs, had not fled far either. He was discovered unconscious in a ditch along the river road, suffering from the head wound he had received during the struggle in the store. He was carried back to Binghamton more dead than alive, placed under guard in a hospital bed, and watched constantly to ensure he did not escape or die before he could be tried for murder. The 3 men were held in the county jail, each in a separate cell, forbidden to communicate with one another. Edward Rulloff asked for his notebook, the one found in the store, and was refused. He asked for books and writing materials and was refused. He asked for a lawyer and was told one would be appointed when the time came for trial. For now he sat in his cell with nothing but his thoughts, replaying the events of that night, analysing where his planning had failed, calculating what might happen in the legal proceedings to come. The funeral of Frederick Halbert took place on August 21st. The entire city seemed to attend, filling the church and spilling out into the street. His widow wept openly, supported by relatives, while his children sat in stunned silence, too young to fully comprehend that their father would not return home. The minister spoke of sudden death and the fragility of life, of the evil that walked among good people, of the need for justice tempered with mercy, though in this case mercy seemed unlikely for men who had killed without provocation or cause. Joseph Burroughs recovered slowly from his wounds. He gave formal statements to the authorities, describing the night's events in as much detail as memory allowed. He identified Edward Jarvis as the shooter, confirmed that Rulloff and Dexter had been present in the store, testified that the burglars had been armed and had fired without warning or attempt at peaceful surrender. His testimony would be crucial at trial, the eyewitness account that would seal the fate of the accused. The newspapers treated the case as a sensation. Here was everything readers desired: violence, death, the dramatic capture of criminals, and the intriguing detail that one of the burglars was apparently a scholar of considerable learning. Who was this educated man who robbed stores by night and studied ancient languages? How had such a person fallen into criminal life? The questions multiplied as reporters investigated and discovered Edward Rulloff's true identity, his previous convictions, his escape from custody decades earlier, and most shocking of all, the murders of his wife and infant daughter back in the 1840s. The story grew with each telling. Edward Rulloff became the educated monster, the genius murderer, the man who could recite Homer while planning robberies and killing those who interrupted him. Editorial writers debated whether education made criminals more dangerous, whether learning divorced from morality created a particular kind of evil. Ministers preached sermons using Rulloff as an example of intelligence corrupted by pride and sin. And through all this commentary and speculation, the man himself sat in his cell, silent and isolated, waiting for the legal machinery that would determine whether he would hang. The grand jury met in early September and returned indictments against all three men: murder in the first degree for the death of Frederick Halbert, attempted murder for the wounding of Joseph Burrows, burglary, and a catalogue of lesser charges. Edward Jarvis was judged too ill from his head wound to stand trial immediately, so the decision was made to try Edward Rulloff first, as the apparent leader and planner of the criminal enterprise. William Dexter would be tried separately after Rulloff's case concluded. The trial was set for January of 1871, giving both prosecution and defence time to prepare their cases. Edward Rulloff was assigned a lawyer, a competent if unspectacular attorney named Henry Beecher, who approached his task with the grim resignation of a man defending the indefensible. The evidence was clear, the crime was brutal, and the defendant's past made any appeal for mercy virtually impossible. But Beecher would do his duty, would mount what defence the law allowed, would ensure that Edward Rulloff received the fair trial that Frederick Halbert had been denied when he was shot down in his own store. Autumn passed, then winter came to Binghamton. Snow covered the streets where Frederick Halbert had walked on his last night alive. Ice formed on the rivers that gave the city its prosperity. And in his cell, Edward Rulloff sat in the cold and the silence, thinking about language and death, about the patterns that connected words across centuries and continents, about the rope that would soon connect his neck to eternity if the jury found him guilty, as everyone expected they would. Chapter 9. The Trial of the Century. The courthouse in Binghamton stood 3 stories tall on Court Street, a structure of red brick and white trim that represented the dignity and authority of law in Broome County. Its courtroom on the 2nd floor could accommodate perhaps 200 spectators when packed to capacity, and on the morning of January 9th, 1871, when the trial of Edward Rulloff began, every seat was filled and crowds stood in the hallways hoping to gain entrance. They came from Binghamton and the surrounding towns, farmers and merchants and their wives, drawn by the spectacle of a murder trial and the opportunity to see the educated killer whose story had filled the newspapers for months. Judge Horace Balcombe presided, a man of 60 years who had served on the bench for 2 decades and brought a reputation for fairness tempered by firmness. He gavelled the courtroom to silence as the bailiff called the proceedings to order, and then Edward Rulloff was brought up from the cells below, flanked by deputies, dressed in a dark suit that his lawyer had obtained for him, so he would not appear before the jury in prison clothes. Rulloff was 54 years old now, his hair almost entirely grey, his frame gaunt from months of confinement and inadequate food. But his bearing remained erect, his expression calm, and when he took his seat at the defence table, he surveyed the crowded courtroom with the detached interest of a scholar observing an experiment. His pale eyes moved across the faces of potential jurors, assessing them with the same analytical attention he had once brought to studying Sanskrit roots or planning burglaries. The selection of the jury consumed 2 full days. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Martin Grover, sought men who would not be swayed by sympathy for an educated defendant or confused by clever arguments about reasonable doubt. The defence, represented by Henry Beecher, sought anyone who might question the evidence, who might distinguish between Rulloff's presence at the burglary and his responsibility for the murder actually committed by Edward Jarvis's hand. But the pool of potential jurors was limited, and most had already formed opinions about the case from newspaper accounts. By the time 12 men were finally seated, both sides understood that this jury would likely convict if the evidence supported the charges. Martin Grover opened for the prosecution on the morning of January 11th. He was a heavy-set man in his 40s, with thick dark hair and a voice that carried to every corner of the courtroom without strain. He outlined the case methodically: the burglary of Halbert Brothers' store, the arrival of Frederick Halbert and Joseph Burrows, the shooting that left 1 man dead and another wounded, the flight of the burglars, and their subsequent capture. He described Edward Rulloff as the leader of the criminal gang, the planner who bore responsibility for everything that occurred, even if he had not personally pulled the trigger. The evidence came next, witness by witness, piece by piece, building the narrative of that August night. Joseph Burroughs testified first, still moving stiffly from his wounds, describing how he and Frederick Halbert had entered the store and found 3 men robbing it. He identified Edward Rulloff as one of those present, confirmed that Rulloff had been holding a lantern, that he had clearly been part of the burglary even if the younger man with dark hair had been the one who fired the shots. Under cross-examination, Henry Beecher tried to establish that Rulloff had not been armed, had not fired any shots, had in fact been merely a bystander to Edward Jarvis's violence. But Joseph Burroughs would not grant that distinction. All 3 men had been committing a crime together, he insisted, and all 3 bore equal guilt for what followed. The jury listened intently, some taking notes, all watching Edward Rulloff to gauge his reaction to the testimony. He showed none, sitting perfectly still, occasionally whispering to his lawyer but displaying no emotion that observers could detect. The medical examiner testified about Frederick Halbert's wound, describing the bullet's path through lung tissue and the massive internal bleeding that had caused death within minutes. The sheriff testified about the manhunt and the capture of Rulloff and Dexter hiding in the woods south of the city. The hotel proprietor identified the 3 men as those who'd taken rooms on the evening of August 17th and left their belongings behind when they fled after the shooting. The prosecution introduced the tools found in the store, the pry bar, the dark lantern, the sacks partially filled with stolen merchandise, and then, with particular emphasis, Martin Grover presented the notebook that had been dropped during the struggle. He opened it to show the jury the pages filled with writing in multiple languages, the diagrams and charts that spoke of scholarship and education. This notebook, he argued, belonged to Edward Rulloff, proved his presence at the scene, and demonstrated that here was no ordinary criminal but a man of learning who had chosen to use his intelligence for evil purposes. Henry Beecher objected that the notebook's contents were irrelevant to the question of who had killed Frederick Halbert. Judge Balcom sustained the objection regarding the intellectual content, but ruled that the notebook itself was admissible as evidence of Rulloff's presence at the crime scene. The prosecution was satisfied with this ruling. The jury had seen the Greek and Latin and Sanskrit, had understood that the defendant was indeed the educated man the newspapers described, and that fact would work against him when they deliberated. The prosecution rested after 3 days of testimony. The case seemed overwhelming. Eyewitness identification, physical evidence, the defendant's own notebook found at the scene. Henry Beecher rose to present the defense with the manner of a man performing an unpleasant duty, rather than fighting for his client's life. His strategy was simple, because no complex strategy was possible given the facts. He would argue that Edward Rulloff, while guilty of burglary, was not guilty of murder because he had not fired the shots that killed Frederick Halbert. Under the law, Beecher contended each man was responsible for his own actions. Edward Jarvis had committed murder, but Rulloff had committed only burglary, and the 2 crimes should not be conflated. The argument was legally sophisticated but emotionally unpersuasive. The prosecution had anticipated this defense and countered it by invoking the felony murder rule, a legal doctrine that held all participants in a dangerous felony responsible for any deaths that occurred during commission of that felony. If men committed burglary together and one of them killed someone, all were guilty of murder regardless of who actually fired the shot. Judge Balcom instructed the jury on this principle, and with that instruction, Rulloff's fate was effectively sealed. Henry Beecher called few witnesses. There was little defense to mount. He could not dispute that Rulloff had been present at the burglary. He could not dispute that Frederick Halbert had died as a result of the criminal enterprise in which Rulloff participated. He attempted to establish that Rulloff had been opposed to carrying weapons, that he had explicitly forbidden his partners to arm themselves, but no witness could testify to these claims because only the criminals themselves knew what instructions had been given. Edward Rulloff declined to testify in his own defense. His lawyer advised against it, knowing that the prosecution would be allowed to question him about his previous convictions about the murders of his wife and daughter, about his entire criminal history. Better to remain silent and hope the jury might distinguish between legal guilt and moral responsibility, though Henry Beecher held little hope that they would. The prosecution and defence made their closing arguments on January 16th. Martin Grover spoke with controlled passion about Frederick Halbert, about his widow and children, about the fundamental principle that men who committed violent crimes must face violent consequences. He dismissed the defence's technical arguments about who fired which shot. The law was clear, he insisted. All participants in the burglary bore equal responsibility for the murder that resulted from it. Edward Rulloff was as guilty as if he had pulled the trigger himself, and the jury should have no hesitation in so finding. Henry Beecher's closing was brief and resigned. He asked the jury to consider carefully the distinction between burglary and murder, to recognise that Edward Rulloff had not intended anyone to die that night, that the violence had been committed by Edward Jarvis acting on his own initiative. But even as he spoke these words, Beecher could see in the jurors' faces that they were not persuaded. The community wanted justice for Frederick Halbert, and Edward Rulloff would provide it whether he had personally fired the fatal shot or not. Judge Balcom instructed the jury for nearly an hour, carefully explaining the elements of murder, the felony murder rule, the standards for reasonable doubt. He sent them to deliberate in mid-afternoon, and they returned before supper with their verdict. The foreman stood and pronounced Edward Rulloff guilty of murder in the first degree, and the courtroom erupted in applause and shouts of satisfaction that Judge Balcom had to gavel into silence. The sentencing took place 2 days later. Edward Rulloff stood before the bench while Judge Balcom read the formal judgment. The court found him guilty of murder in the commission of burglary. The law prescribed only one penalty for such a crime. Edward Rulloff would be hanged by the neck until dead, the execution to take place on May 26, 1871, in the county jail yard in Binghamton. Rulloff listened to the sentence without visible reaction. When asked if he had anything to say, he declined to speak. He was led back to his cell while the spectators filed out of the courthouse, already discussing the trial and the coming execution. Some expressed satisfaction that justice had been done. Others debated whether hanging was sufficient punishment for a man who had killed multiple times over the course of decades. And a very few, wondered whether the world might be losing something valuable when it executed a man of such obvious intellectual gifts, even if those gifts had been devoted to criminal purposes. But the majority felt no such ambivalence. Edward Rulloff had murdered his wife and infant daughter. He had led a gang of burglars who killed a respected merchant. He deserved to hang, and the community looked forward to witnessing his execution as the proper conclusion to a life spent in violation of every principle of decency and law. In his cell, Edward Rulloff requested his notebooks and was surprised when the request was granted. The trial was over, he was condemned, and there seemed no harm in allowing him to spend his final months with his linguistic theories. He settled into the routine of a man awaiting execution, the daily inspection of his cell to ensure he had not obtained means of suicide, the regular meals pushed through the bars, the occasional visit from his lawyer working on appeals that both men knew would likely fail. And he wrote. He filled page after page with his theories about language, convinced even now that his work had value, that someday scholars would recognize his contributions even if the world remembered him primarily as a murderer. The certainty of approaching death did not trouble him as much as the frustration of leaving his work unfinished, his theories unpublished, his discoveries known only to himself. Winter turned to spring outside his cell window. The snow melted, the rivers rose with runoff, and the world grew green again. And in the county jail, the carpenter began building the scaffold on which Edward Rulloff would die when May arrived and the law had its final word. Chapter 10. The Final Translation. The scaffold stood in the jail yard, a simple construction of heavy timber and iron. built to precise specifications that would ensure death came quickly when the trapdoor fell. The carpenter who built it was a man named Thomas Wheeler, and he took no pleasure in his work, though he completed it with professional competence. He tested the mechanism repeatedly, dropping sandbags of various weights to ensure the trap would function smoothly, that the rope would hold, that everything would proceed with the grim efficiency the law required. The scaffold stood ready by the middle of April, and Edward Rulloff could see it from his cell window if he stood on his cot and looked down into the yard below. He did not look often. The scaffold's presence was a fact he acknowledged but did not dwell upon. His attention remained focused on his linguistic manuscripts, on the theories he continued to refine even as the days counted down toward his execution. He wrote steadily through April and into May, requesting additional paper when his supply ran low, occasionally asking his lawyer Henry Beecher to clarify some point of grammar or etymology when his own knowledge reached its limits. The appeals that Beecher filed on Rulloff's behalf proceeded through the courts with predictable results. The conviction was upheld at every level. The evidence had been properly admitted, the jury instructions correct, the verdict supported by overwhelming proof. The New York Court of Appeals declined to intervene. The governor refused to grant clemency, stating that Edward Rulloff had forfeited any claim to mercy through his long career of crime, culminating in the murder of Frederick Halbert. The execution would proceed as scheduled on May 26, 1871. Newspapers continued to publish stories about the condemned man, and the coverage took a strange turn in the final weeks before his execution. Scholars and linguists who had somehow learned of Rulloff's work began to express interest in his theories. A professor from Yale visited the jail and spent several hours examining Rulloff's manuscripts. He emerged from that meeting shaken, telling reporters that whatever else Rulloff might be, he was also a genuine scholar whose insights into language demonstrated profound learning and original thinking. The professor suggested that Rulloff's work deserved preservation and study, that it would be a loss to science if his theories died with him on the scaffold. Other academics followed, drawn by curiosity and the macabre appeal of a murderer who was also an intellectual. They found Edward Rulloff eager to discuss his work, articulate in explaining his theories, capable of engaging in sophisticated debate about philology and etymology. These visitors left the jail troubled, confronted with the uncomfortable reality that evil and intelligence were not mutually exclusive, that a man could be both a monster and a scholar, that the mind that had planned murders could also construct elaborate theories about the origins of human speech. A movement began, small but vocal, arguing that Edward Rulloff's sentence should be commuted to life imprisonment so that his scholarly work could continue. Petitions were circulated, letters written to the governor, arguments made that society would benefit more from Rulloff's continued intellectual production than from his death. The condemned man himself remained indifferent to these efforts. He neither encouraged nor discouraged those who argued for his life, apparently accepting that his fate was sealed and that any reprieve would be temporary at best. The governor reviewed the petitions and refused all of them. Whatever intellectual gifts Edward Rulloff possessed, they did not absolve him of responsibility for his crimes. He had murdered his wife and infant daughter. He had led a gang that killed Frederick Halbert. The law prescribed death for such crimes, and death he would receive. The execution would proceed as scheduled. May arrived warm and dry, the spring progressing into early summer. In the jail, Edward Rulloff's routine remained unchanged until the final week of his life. He rose when the bell rang at dawn, ate the breakfast brought to his cell, spent his days writing and reading, spoke briefly with guards or visitors when required, and retired to his narrow cot when evening came. He showed no signs of fear or despair, maintained the same detached calm that had characterized his entire adult life, gave those who observed him no satisfaction of seeing him break under the weight of approaching death. On May 23rd, 3 days before his execution, Rulloff completed what he considered the final version of his major work on linguistics. He had titled it Method in the Formation of Language, and it ran to nearly 400 pages of dense text filled with examples from dozens of languages. charts showing phonetic relationships, arguments about the common roots of human speech. He gave the manuscript to Henry Beecher with instructions to find a publisher, or at least to preserve the work in an academic library where future scholars might study it. Beecher promised to do what he could, though privately he doubted that any publisher would touch the work of a condemned murderer regardless of its intellectual merit. The prison chaplain visited daily during that final week, attempting to prepare Rulloff's soul for eternity. The chaplain was a Methodist minister named Thomas Armitage, earnest in his faith, genuinely concerned for the spiritual welfare of those in his charge. He urged Rulloff to confess his sins, to seek God's forgiveness, to prepare to meet his Maker with a repentant heart. Edward Rulloff listened politely to these exhortations but declined to engage with them seriously. He had no faith in God or afterlife, believed that death meant simply the cessation of consciousness, that confession and repentance were social rituals without transcendent meaning. On the evening of May 25th, Rulloff's last night alive, the chaplain made a final attempt to break through the condemned man's indifference to matters of salvation. He spoke of heaven and hell, of judgment and mercy, of the terrible price of unrepented sin. Edward Rulloff finally responded, not with confession, but with a question. He asked the chaplain to explain how a just God could create beings capable of such evil if God truly possessed the omnipotence and benevolence that Christianity claimed. The question was not new, but Rulloff pursued it with such logical precision that the chaplain found himself stumbling over answers, unable to resolve the paradox to Rulloff's satisfaction or his own. They parted near midnight, the chaplain troubled and exhausted, the condemned man calm and seemingly at peace with whatever awaited him. Rulloff slept briefly on his cot, waking before dawn on May 26th to the sound of hammering in the jail yard as workers made final preparations for the execution. He washed from the basin in his cell, combed his grey hair, dressed in the clean shirt and dark trousers that had been provided for the occasion. Breakfast came, but he ate little, finding his appetite absent, though his hands remained steady. The sheriff arrived at 8 o'clock with deputies and the death warrant. He read the formal language of the document. By the authority of the state of New York, in accordance with the judgment of the court, Edward Howard Rulloff would be hanged by the neck until dead for the crime of murder in the first degree. Rulloff listened without comment, nodded to indicate he understood, and asked only if he might carry his Greek New Testament with him to the scaffold. The request was granted. They emerged from the cell block into bright morning sunlight. The jail yard had been prepared for the execution. The scaffold stood in the centre, the rope already noosed and waiting, wooden benches arranged for the official witnesses required by law. Perhaps 50 people were present, law enforcement officers, county officials, newspaper reporters, a physician who would confirm death when it occurred. No members of the public were admitted, as executions in New York had become private affairs conducted behind jail walls rather than public spectacles in town squares. Edward Rulloff mounted the scaffold steps with firm stride, declining assistance from the deputies who flanked him. He stood on the trap door while the sheriff adjusted the noose around his neck. The rope was new hemp, carefully measured to provide the drop that would break his neck cleanly rather than strangling him slowly. Rulloff looked out over the assembled witnesses, his expression distant, as though his mind had already departed to wherever consciousness went when the body ceased. The sheriff asked if he had any final words. Edward Rulloff declined to speak. The chaplain said a brief prayer that went unacknowledged by the condemned man. The sheriff placed a black hood over Rulloff's head, checked the rope one final time, and stepped back from the trap door. He raised his hand, held it there for a long moment, then brought it down in a sharp cutting motion. The trapdoor fell with a crash of wood on iron. Edward Rulloff dropped through the opening, the rope snapping taut, his body jerking once and then hanging still. The physician moved forward with his stethoscope, waiting the required time before checking for heartbeat. After 15 minutes, he pronounced Edward Howard Rulloff dead, and the body was lowered to a waiting coffin. There was no one to claim the remains. No family came forward, No friends requested burial rites. The body was turned over to a local physician who had expressed interest in studying the brain of so intelligent a criminal. The doctor removed Rulloff's brain, preserved it in alcohol, and displayed it for years afterward in his office as a curiosity. The skull measurements and brain weight were recorded in medical journals, part of the 19th century's attempt to correlate physical structures with intelligence and criminality. The rest of the body was buried in an unmarked grave in the county cemetery, and Edward Rulloff's physical presence vanished from the earth. His manuscript survived longer than his flesh. Henry Beecher did manage to place some of Rulloff's linguistic work in the library at Cornell University, where it remained largely unstudied for decades. A few scholars examined the theories over the years, finding them interesting but ultimately flawed, based on insights mixed with misconceptions, demonstrating genuine learning but not the revolutionary breakthrough that Rulloff had believed he achieved. The work was eventually relegated to archives where it gathered dust, remembered only as a footnote in the history of philology. The linguistic theories of a murderer, curious but not significant, a reminder that intelligence alone guaranteed neither moral worth nor lasting contribution to human knowledge. The story of Edward Rulloff appeared in newspapers and magazines for years after his execution. He became a cautionary tale, an example of education divorced from morality, of intelligence corrupted by pride and selfishness. Ministers preached sermons using his life to illustrate the dangers of learning without faith. Reformers argued about whether education made criminals more dangerous, or whether proper moral instruction alongside academic learning might have saved such a man from his fate. The debates continued long after everyone who had known Rulloff personally had died, his story becoming myth and moral lesson rather than historical reality. The Schutt family in Ithaca received word of the execution with quiet satisfaction. William Schutt had died years earlier without seeing his daughter's murderer brought to final justice, but his surviving children felt that some measure of closure had been achieved. The graves of Harriet and Priscilla remained in the Methodist churchyard, the stones weathered now, the names fading but still legible to those who cared to look. The family visited occasionally, bringing flowers in summer, standing silently in remembrance of lives cut short by a man who valued his books more than their existence. Frederick Halbert's widow never remarried. She raised her children alone, working as a seamstress, accepting charity from her late husband's business partners when necessary. She attended the execution, one of the few women present, wanting to witness the end of the man who had made her a widow. She watched Edward Rulloff hang without tears or satisfaction, feeling only emptiness where she had hoped to find closure. She left the jail yard and returned to her life, carrying the weight of loss that no execution could lighten. The city of Binghamton gradually forgot the details of that August night in 1870. New crimes occurred, new scandals captured public attention, and eventually the murder at Halbert Brothers' store became just another old story, told occasionally by old men who remembered when it happened, but fading like all history fades when those who witnessed events pass away and leave only written records that few bother to read. The scaffold in the jail yard was dismantled after the execution, the lumber sold or burned, the iron fittings stored against some future need. New prisoners occupied the cell where Edward Rulloff had spent his final months. The routine of prison life continued unchanged. The bells marking time, the lockstep marches, the silence and isolation that defined punishment in the 19th century. The world moved forward, indifferent to the man who had believed his intelligence made him superior to ordinary constraints of law and morality. And in the darkness of historical record, Edward Rulloff remains, scholar and murderer, linguist and thief, a man of vast learning and empty conscience, who killed his wife and infant daughter, who led others into crime and violence, who died on the scaffold still convinced that his intellectual work mattered more than the lives he had destroyed. His story serves as a reminder that brilliance alone ensures nothing, that education without compassion creates monsters as easily as it creates benefactors, and that in the end all men stand equal before death regardless of how many languages they can speak or how many theories they can construct. The sun set on May 26th, 1871. The jail yard lay empty and silent, and somewhere in the gathering darkness, history closed its book on Edward Rulloff, adding his name to the long catalogue of those who believe themselves above consequence, only to discover too late that no intelligence, no learning, no brilliant theory could save them from the judgment they had earned through their choices and their crimes. The night deepened, the stars emerged cold and distant, and in the eternal silence that follows all human voices, Edward Rulloff's story came at last to its inevitable end. The Bedside Historian thanks you for listening tonight. May your rest be peaceful, and may history's dark lessons find you safely in your dreams. Good night.